for example, when Ollie Godsey, the CEO of Databricks, and I have dinner, we almost always just talk about like category creation and building out go-to-market. From a technology standpoint, it's actually a very, very interesting problem. It's one that's not talked about enough. And so I just spend a lot of time trying to understand, like, how the market's evolving, what are the macro trends, who are the players, what's involved, et cetera. And I try and go very deep. And then based on that, then we try and make, decisions that we think are smart decisions in the space.
I mean, this is my job. You say, go-to-market applied to category creation isn't talked about enough. What do you think should be talked about within GTM and category creation that isn't being talked about?
Well, can you name a good resource for category creation?
No, not like a centralized.
How about a decent one? I mean, let me tell you, it's not Play Bigger.
No, I can't.
Where would you go read about category creation? Let's say you're a new infrastructure company like me. So listen, I was very, very heavily involved in the creation of software-defined network and network virtualization. I spent 10 years, I call it market annealing, just hammering the shit out of a market, just fucking beating on the market for years until it comes around. This is like selling into an existing market's easy, man. The annealing you've got to do to soften up a market for categorization is hard. Where would you even start to read about that? Who?
I think
name a blog or a Twitter post or.
I think what I would advise is you learn from people who've done it before, and so
Exactly.
I would advise a one-to-one conversation and dialogue with someone who's done it before.
100%. It's just something that hasn't really hit. There is no crossing the chasm for category creation, really. For the types of technologies I'm interested in, it's as important as the product development, and it's as tricky and it's as hard and whatever. And so I just think it's a very, very interesting space.
How do you think about market timing with regards to category creation? Because the one thing that worries me is that the market can kind of continuously stay irrational for longer than a company can stay solvent, especially on the adoption side and the innovation side. And so how do you think about the importance of market timing?
It's kind of interesting. Have you ever played I'm going to go, it's going to sound like a tangent, but then I'm going to come back to your question, which is, have you ever played, Go, or do you know about the game Go?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So the state space is so stupidly large that, you read these kind of books about Go, and there's these kind of cones, these almost aphorisms that are kind of very helpful, but none of them are very definitive. It's stay away from density, these things, which actually they turn to be very useful, but they're just, so I think that there's some cones that you can say about market timing that are useful. But again, I'm not trying to be definitive at all. I just want to make the point that the state space is so enormous and is so underdetermined, right? So a few things. So for one, I think working against a macro trend is just brutal. And so forget timing. It's listen, if a market is shrinking, if a trend is moving away from you, while there's still market and opportunity there, if the first derivative is negative, you're just in a really tough spot. Does that make sense? And so I would say, independent of specific timing, just make sure the second one is, there's varying degrees of market readiness, and I think this is just more correlated with the amount of effort that you as a startup need to do to establish yourself, right? So for example, if I am selling into an existing market with something that's 10 times faster, the timing question is not really a question. It's easier to sell. It ends up being kind of questions around churn and pricing pressure and stuff like that, right? Just because the category already exists. When it comes to category creation, I think that companies that really put in the time will carve out a niche. And then the question is more what's the staying power of the company, and how much money do you want to invest in the go-to-market death march of a new category? And you can, listen, I know of companies that through just absolutely sheer will built markets. And it wasn't timing, it was just sheer fucking will, but they spent a decade doing it. So I would say make sure you're trend aligned. Realize that if you're in a new market, the amount of work you're gonna have to do to kind of, again, I call it market annealing, but make the market pliable is gonna be commensurate with your speed, and then hopefully things unlock. But I believe you can death march to a public company without the market ever actually unlocking.
The thing that I think is fascinating is the state of storytelling state is, I think, pretty poor. And I think in market creation and category creation, it's more important than ever. How do you feel about the importance of storytelling on the founder perspective with regards to category creation?
So I think it's very, very important, and not just for educating the market, but even leading a team.
Yeah.
I would say the two best people on this, who both should write books, are McJanet and Steve Mullaney. So Dave McJanet, CEO of Hashi. Steve Mullaney, he's a CEO of Aviatrix. Both come from product marketing backgrounds. Both are like iconic world-class CEOs. And what they'll tell you, which I think is exactly right, is, it's very important at some point in time to kick everybody out of the room, sit there for 3 days, and then write down the very lucid, very description vision of the company, like why it matters and what you're doing in a way that you deeply believe, in a way that outlines the future and outlines kind of the why together. It doesn't have to be the path, just the future. And then you use that to kind of drive everything about the company, from like recruiting to culture setting to, early sales to marketing to speaking to analysts, et cetera. And so I do think that in early categories, it is just a crucial exercise to do.
Can I ask you, we sit and look at, many companies today, some in your portfolio, some not in your portfolio, creating amazing categories with incredible innovative technology. And with a change of funding environment, suddenly they're being told, cut burn, cut costs, and that naturally impacts one's ability to expel emission, to tell stories through events, to really project the category forward. How do you advise them who are in the process of creating a category, but also being told to cut burn and reduce spend?
I don't think that these things are at odds. I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy. So
okay.
I would view it a little bit different. So let me tell you what I think is a mistake to do. Companies should be sized to the market opportunity and the funding environment, right? Otherwise, everybody loses their job and the company goes to zero, right? And so if the macro situation on this stuff changes, like the funding environment, or you've got to right size the company in order to do that, just so the company can stay viable. And so what I see happen at large companies, and smaller companies are much better at this, which is great, but I think we can use large public companies as an example of what not to do, is often the first thing everybody says is let's freeze hiring. Yeah. So the problem with freezing hiring, it happens in large public companies, is you're basically out of the hiring market, and then normally performance management kind of goes out of the window, because like every manager is like, we're not even backfilling a trip, so I'm not letting anybody go. Like I'm not moving people around. I'm not going to put this player into like another team where they'd be better served, right? And then you're also not adjusting the company relative to the needs of the market and the company. Like what if you have to like invest more in sales and less in R&D or something like that? You can't make those types of decisions. And so I think that if you have a market contraction, you need to decide, like, listen, like, is our existing operating plan, is that still viable in the current market? Because you can't control the macro. And if it's not, I would actually do a full replan to make sure that you can still operate like a company would. Just because the market shrunk 20% doesn't mean you don't have a company. It's just that your company now has to operate, you've got to cut somewhere. And it could just be spend. It could be all sorts of stuff. It doesn't have to be layoffs or rifts or anything like that. And so, again, I think you're going to have to do category creation regardless of cutting spend or not cutting spend. It's independent. I just think that you need to be very thoughtful when markets contract and capital contract about how you run your business.